Welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. Scott Miller from Salt Lake City, Utah. He's a returning guest. He's been on our show, 3 or 4 times. And for all my listeners, you probably know him from his smiling face, from Franklin Covey, from Management Messes, and the list goes on and on and on. But let me just tell you a few of the books that he has written. The new one we're going to be talking about is Master Mentors. That just released September 7th. Marketing Messes, Brand Success was another one of the books he was on with. Management Messes to Leadership Success. And if you haven't figured out by now, Job Mess to Career Success. He's got a whole series of books that he's writing in that genre, in that category. So, Scott, welcome to you today. You don't need much introduction simply because you've been on the show many times. And I think I'll forego the formal introduction and just get into it. This new book comes from your leadership series and all the people that you've interviewed over, eons and eons there. But it's called Master Mentors, 30 Transformative Insights from Our Greatest Minds. And in the introduction, you selected 30, and you easily, it's pretty tough to probably skin them all down to 30 leadership guests that were on your show, but Master Mentors. Can you tell us the story about selecting the 30 mentors and why it was so important in writing this book? Why did you bring this book out now?
Greg, thank you. And thanks, by the way, for the platform. Again, I appreciate the spotlight. So as your listeners and viewers might know, I am privileged to host what is the world's largest weekly leadership podcast now called On Leadership with Scott Miller. It's about 7 million leaders every Tuesday when it airs, audio and video. Some of the greatest minds in business and industry, celebrities, actors, some not so famous, but they've had some significant discoveries that we share. And so it's from this podcast where we had 175 episodes every week for nonstop 3 years that I felt, Greg, like there was so many insights that have been shared off air. What happens 3 minutes before we go live, or what happens after we click, the video off, and then they share something really fascinating off air.
Yeah.
Or perhaps it was, in the elevator or something. So with their permission, I selected 30 of these 170 guests. By the way, there are 10 books in the series. So this is volume 1. Volume 2 is just being finished. I'm starting volume 3. So every year there'll be a new 30 coming out. Volume 2 hits next year. But this was really about me picking 30 people that I thought had something transformative to share about their own journey. Mm-hmm. The book is very episodic. One chapter is about brain health. The other is about gratitude. Another one is about, your peak, your trough, and your recovery. It's a very episodic book, fast, easy, breezy. I think is going to pick up the mantle of Chicken Soup for Your Soul and be the next series like that. And so I'm delighted to be here today to talk about any of those you'd like to.
Well, you have 30 profiled in there, and obviously it's hard to select who you want to talk about. But I was just watching the video about Nick Vujicic. I think that's how you say Vujicic.
Yes.
And, I honestly have to admit, I'd never seen him before. But after I finished watching the 60 Minutes report, a young man born with no legs, no arms, literally an inspiration beyond belief, to see what he's accomplished in his life and how many people he's helped. Can you relay his story a little bit, and what you kind of say is what was being required of him to evolve into what you call a master mentor? He speaks to spiritual groups, religious groups, kind of
and business groups, right?
And business groups, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But again, this is someone who, no matter where they spoke, would make you think that your problems were nothing.
It's very true. It's a great setup. I'll try to keep this succinct. Nick Vujicic, as you mentioned, was born with no limbs, no arms, no legs. Like you and I, he has a head, a neck, a torso, and his body ends just beneath his groin. He's a very small foot-like appendage with a couple of kind of small toes on it that he can text with, but that's about it. No arms, no legs. Nick has written several books. He's sold millions of copies of these books. He's an inspiration to hundreds of millions of people because he tried to take his life early on. He felt like he was going to be a burden to his parents. He tried to kill himself as a child. He was unsuccessful. and he began to discover his mission, his purpose for spreading light, for spreading gratitude, not for what he didn't have, but for what he did have. And it seems like a cliche, but Nick was one of our early guests. I think he was guest number 100. We interviewed him as our 100th episode. And then you may know that every month, my wife and I, Stephanie, we live in Salt Lake City. We're fairly well known now for having these sort of monthly celebrity dinner parties where we fly in an ambassador or a governor or some celebrity rock star. We gather 15, 20 friends and we drink champagne and learn and listen to them. Nick came to my house one evening for one of these dinners, and I didn't know him very well. We'd met once or twice. We became fast friends. And I was watching Nick sit across from me on a sofa in my living room, and Nick was scratching his head like a cat would scratch their head by, like, you know, taking his forehead and scratching it on my sofa.
Right.
And I looked down and I had a glass of water in my hand and I was just drinking it unconsciously because I was thirsty. And then later in the evening, I was watching Nick at the dinner table, balance himself on his torso. He's no arms and no legs. He cannot drink alone. He cannot eat alone. He cannot dress alone. He cannot walk. He cannot save himself from a burning building. He cannot use the restroom alone. And I was eating a piece of key lime pie. I don't even remember picking the pie up. And it dawned on me, Greg, that age 51, I didn't know what gratitude was. I didn't know how important it is to be able to scratch your head or adjust your glasses or get a drink of water or light a candle or any of the thousands of things we do a day unconsciously and reflexively. And for me, talking to Nick, listening to him build this amazing life, inspiring others to be grateful for what you have and kind of even ignore what you don't, or just create some workarounds. And the big idea in the chapter, although it's titled Gratitude, is about living your life through the lens of I have to, I ought to, or I get to. And the story I share is, living here in Salt Lake City, it's winter half the year, and typical Sunday evening in December, it'll be 4 degrees outside. It'll be 9 o'clock. I'm ready to go to bed. And I realize I've got to take the garbage out. And I'm like, and so I'm wrapping the garbage up, going down a flight of stairs, out to a driveway that is iced over, slipping and sliding out to the garbage cans, my pajamas, where I realize finally that it's garbage day the next day. And I got to take 3 massive garbage cans down 70 yards to the street. And it's always been a huge burden until I met Nick Vujicic. And I realized I have to take the garbage out. I ought to take the garbage out. I get to take the garbage out because Nick Vujicic cannot take the garbage out. So
yeah, and the other thing, Scott, is you don't have to pick up the garbage.
I don't have to pick up the garbage.
Think that about the guy that's driving the truck that's picking up your garbage.
At 7 in the morning where it's snowing and icing out.
Exactly.
You are exactly right. And so for me, the transformational insight, and many of these are a duh, but I think it was Voltaire that said common knowledge isn't common practice. That is to be grateful for everything we have and look through everything in life, whether it's a termination you're facing tomorrow, whether it is a high courage conversation with your child or spouse or neighbor or mother-in-law, paying 1/10 of your visa bill because you can't afford 10/10 of your visa bill. I get to fire someone because they hate this job and they're not right for the job. I'm going to send them into a new phase of their life. I'm trying to make all of my interactions every day moving from I have to and I ought to I get to be on at 2 in the morning and deliver 3 keynotes to Dubai clients at 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. I don't dread that. I get to do that. You get the point, but it's been transformative for me.
Well, any of my listeners now know who he is. Let's get Scott's book. You can read about him. You can also go on the internet at Master Mentors. You can learn more about him, most certainly, by just typing in his name, and you'll see all kinds of videos. Now, in the chapter about Dave Hollis, you identified and ranked 3 competencies required from leaders. And I just did an interview with Jacob Morgan, the future leader. I had the guys on from Deloitte about their book Provoke yesterday. And, all of this is around leadership because we're seeing so many changes in the world and it's happening so fast. And leaders today, more than ever, need to have a new skill set. They need to adopt and adapt quickly, and COVID wasn't the only thing that brought this on, although COVID exacerbated this issue. Can you let our listeners know what these 3 competencies are and why you believe they're so important? Because you're doing a whole podcast show on leaders.
It's true. If I remember them correctly, they go something like this. I profess, after 3 decades in the leadership industry as the chief marketing officer of the largest leadership company in the world, Franklin Covey, I've learned a few things. I think the number one role of a leader is not mission, vision, and values, and not systems, structures, and strategies. Those are important. You have to do them. I think it's to recruit and retain competent leaders. Recruit and retain, because the whole world right now is looking for a job. The Great Resignation is like the complete resignation. Everybody has been released generally from their hostage situation the last 18 months, and people are now on the hunt to be valued, to be respected, to be engaged, to be fulfilled. And so your job is not just to recruit, but to retain. I think we spend too much time recruiting and not enough retaining, inoculating our key producers from your competition. Because if you don't think every one of your top producers right now is in deep conversations with your competition, you're a fool. Every one of them is in conversations with a recruiter right now and is being offered more money and better conditions and all the things that you weren't willing to have happen. Recruit and retain talent. I think the second role is to offer people feedback on their blind spots. This is the primary job of when somebody is in the role, is to give them the gift of moving outside your comfort zone and discussing the undiscussables about their perhaps communication style or their punctuality, or maybe it's their personal hygiene. Maybe it's how they collaborate. Maybe they're the know-it-all. They don't know that they're the know-it-all. Is giving this gift to people around their blind spots. We all have them, but as a leader, it's your job to have these high courage conversations where you balance courage with diplomacy and make sure people know what it's like to work with them. And then lastly, I think, one of your competencies is vulnerability. Just like, calculating EBITDA or cost of goods or inventory turns, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be able to own your mess, teach through your mess, speak about your successes and your failures openly, not gratuitously, not like a confessional, but to have the confidence and the humility to be able to make others comfortable discussing their challenges. When people are lying to you in the workplace, it says more about you than it does about them. It means you've not created a culture where people feel safe to own their mess because you as a leader have not owned yours.
So you've said a lot, and then kind of unpack it, really. The reality is everything you said are the skills and traits and personality that leaders need to have today. And I would add to that a big dose of compassion and understanding and authenticity. The worst thing you can do is tell a lie. Okay. And the lies turn into things that can really have whiplash within you personally and the organization. And so I echo everything you said. I think it's perfect. Again, for my listeners, go pick up the book. You can read about that. You also can go, we'll promote the channel and the podcasts. And so, in the chapter about David Pink, you speak about, or Daniel Pink, concept called peak through and recovery. What advice can you give us or the listeners about organizing their day in better alignment with their own rhythm and energy using that concept? Because, every leader, it's about energy management. I just had Jim Lohr on here, right? And Dr. Jim Lohr is the Power of Full Engagement, sold millions of books. Yep. But his new book is interesting. It's about leadership. Okay. What I would say is, what would you tell people about rhythm and energy and how they can help manage it?
Yeah. So David Pink, of course, right? Famous author, wrote the books Drive, and recently wrote a book called When,
right?
All about timing. And he popularized this concept of your circadian cycle, understanding your peak, your trough, and your recovery. And I don't know how I made it to be 53 years old. I'd never heard this concept, but this idea is we all have a peak, a trough, and a recovery. And it made sense to me. Maybe I'd heard the concept, but I'd never applied it in my life. And after, interviewing Dan Pink, which I've done now several times, he's a friend of mine, has endorsed my books as well. I realized that my peak every day is about 4 a.m. to about 10 or 11 in the morning. I do my writing from about 4 to 6. Sometimes it's 5, but usually 4 o'clock. I write early, my ink column, my blogs, the books that I write. My best thinking, Greg, is done from 4 a.m. to about 10 or 11 in the morning. It's when my genius comes out. And then I usually have a trough, an energy trough between like 11 and 1 or so. Maybe it's 2, where I don't go to sleep like, a siesta, but I don't do my most critical thinking. And then I have a bit of a recovery from about 1 to 5 or so. And the big aha for me was to make sure I schedule my day deliberately around when am I at my best and avoid things when I'm not at my best because of my trough. I don't schedule meetings with the CFO to review my second quarter budget at noon.
Well, you're doing pretty darn good if you're in a trough right now because it's noon.
Well, my trough.
That's why I usually schedule my podcasts between 8 and 10 in the morning, but Drew scheduled this one at noon. Yeah. But so you're doing darn good, Scott, if you're in a trough right now.
Well, technically it's 1:30 in Salt Lake City. I'm starting to come out, but
you're on the other side.
I'm coming on the other side. But you get the point, right? For me, there's a couple big ideas. One is to sit down and deliberately understand when is your peak, when is your trough, and when is your recovery, and schedule those most important activities when you're at your best and not at your worst. Yeah. But also, it's to communicate that to your colleagues. Here's a good example. In the book, I write a chapter about, I have a very competent director of public relations. She works 12 hours a day, but she works like 9 to like 9. Well, by 9 o'clock, I'm 5 hours into my peak. And so she starts getting into hers like around noon or 1 or 2. And then her recovery comes, midday. So she starts sending me 15 emails. My day is done at 4 o'clock. I've worked 12 hours. I'm done. So we had to get on the same page to recognize, as the leader, she had to kind of align closer to my schedule, but I also had to align to hers as well. This is not a transformational insight for everyone. Like all 30 of them, they're going to hit you kind of where you are in your career, where you are in your role as spouse or parent or partner or widow or promoted or divorced or bankrupted or you name it. This was profound for me because it made me more deliberately and intentionally schedule not just the things that I wanted to focus on, but when to focus on them.
Well, sound advice, because everybody has a circadian rhythm.
That's right.
And they just have to figure out where it is and when it is. I know what mine is, and I know how it works. And like you, I'm not my best probably after like 5 o'clock because I get up early. Okay. We just had Jim Hewling on about the 4 disciplines of execution as a result of you. And Chris McChesney also wrote that book with him, along with Sean Covey. And they talk about execution. And you quoted him in saying that, attaining wildly important goals, which, most corporations teach this. I think 4 million people have been through it, including 250,000 employees at Marriott. That's right. And the role of the leader in the business is really execution process is kind of critical. Can you speak with the listeners about these 4 disciplines? Because it's something that Covey teaches. It's part of their course. Yeah. It's a Covey book. And maybe a little bit of research and why you're Chris as a leader, or Jim or Scott, were all great leaders in of themselves, the authors.
Yeah, I think the big idea in the book, and the book, as you mentioned, is the best-selling book in the world around strategy execution. The big idea is there will always be more ideas than there is capacity to execute them. That leaders that execute do a couple of things that are consistent. They have a fierce focus and discipline to be able to say no to the good at the expense of the great. They are expert at goal setting. They understand that the organizational psychology is people generally cannot do more than one thing at a time with excellence. That you cannot delude yourself into thinking you can have 8 or 10 wildly important goals. You're never going to get them accomplished. You cannot land more than one plan at a time. So they teach in the first discipline, if you will, this idea of setting wildly important goals. They call them WIGs, W-I-G-S. And the methodology is from X to Y by when. Every goal you set should have this goal setting theory of from X to Y by when. It should have both lead and lag measures. A lot of goals only have lag measures, but you also have to have lead measures that are influenceable, that you actually can influence and change them.
Exactly.
The big idea I write about in the book is discipline 2, which is this idea of create a compelling scoreboard. I think so many organizations have scoreboards, but they're in some comptroller's Excel spreadsheet in her laptop.
And they're not seeing them.
And they're not seeing them. And nobody knows if you're winning or losing, except for the executive team every Friday, you know, at 3 o'clock when the chairman or whoever, you get the point. That scoreboards, which is the great insight in the book, need to be fun and visual and compelling. They should not be in Excel. They should not be in the comptroller's laptop or the sales vice president's laptop. They should be on the wall on a 40-page banner, or they should be in crayon or in, you know, paint. They should have, you know, fun engagement that you as the leader should not be creating them. Your team should be creating them, right? No involvement, no commitment. That people should be able to tell in a moment's notice, are we winning against increasing customer retention from 48% to 49% by the end of next month? Exactly. And what's my role in it? And how often is this updated? By the day, by the hour. It can be electronic. It can be digital on a wall. It can be just fun things with thumb depressors and broomsticks, or, you know, you name it. You name it. But your team needs to own the scoreboard, and they need to rally around it, probably with some regular cadence. Talk about, are they winning? Are they losing? What can they change? But scoreboarding is all based on the fundamental idea that people want to win.
Well,
game.
It also makes them accountable. Let's face it. One of those 4 is accountability, right? I know because I teach this stuff as well. So the reality is getting it, but the scoreboard is the most important because that's what's visual. That's what people see, and that's what they'll work on and report on. You know, look, Daniel Amen and I are good friends. He's been on your show. Yeah, I met him through another author in Oregon, and we've done many podcasts together. And I know he's maybe one of your favorites, and you picked him out for this top 30. Yeah. And you speak about protecting your brain and the brain of those that you care about. You know, Daniel always says the brain is always listening, right? That's his newest book. Can you tell the listeners about Daniel and teachings, and share with us this Dr. Oz of the brain, because that's what he's kind of referred to. And, you know, just so everybody knows, his studies started with the average person, then went to the NFL, looking at people who were having brain injuries as a result of playing football, and then on to the fact that many of them committed suicide or had such brain injuries. So they were trying to figure out what was going on. So tell us a little bit about Daniel and what you gleaned from him as a leader.
Well, you share in common a respect and a love for Daniel Amen like you. He's a dear friend of mine, and I'm a raving fan. Of course, he is a board-certified psychiatrist, brain imaging expert, and neuroscientist. He is the founder and owner of 9 Amen clinics across the nation. Yep. Many of your podcast listeners and viewers know of him from the many books that he's written. Also, he's on PBS like every hour on the hour, helping PBS raise money as well. Daniel Amen is probably the first physician in my generation to talk about the importance of caring for the one organ that most of us don't treat or even be able to, or can't see. And that is the brain. And that the big aha, I think, is that I don't think most people understand your brain is kind of like the consistency of tofu. It's like Jell-O. Your brain is like Jell-O.
Yeah.
And you've got this really sharp, pointy skull that's protecting it. That's kind of an oxymoron. And that we have got to be noticeably more intentional with how we care for our brain, how we protect our brain from energy. I have the privilege of being the dad, the frustrating privilege of being the dad of 3 young sons that are 7, 9, and 11. And I'm militant about helmets on anything with wheels.
Yeah, of course.
Hoverboard, bicycle, scooter, pogo stick,
electric bike,
anything. It goes in the garbage can if I catch you on it without a helmet. Because what Daniel Amen has inculcated in me is that there are so many people that are your and my age, older and younger. They've had 3 marriages. They've had 3 bankruptcies. They can't keep a job. They have an angry disposition. These aren't bad people. They probably, in many cases, have an untreated brain injury. They fell out of the bunk bed when they were 9. They got, knocked unconscious when they were 12 in a football game. They fell off a bike and they kind of shook it off, and their prefrontal cortex is on fire. And so the chapter is about not being the popular dad. In fact, when my book is published now, I'll lose all followers in Texas and Oklahoma because I vilify football. My children do not play football. They play tennis. They snow ski with a helmet. They water ski. We mountain bike. But we do all these things like fully protected, where there is very little, hopefully brain injury. We bike on the trails. We ski on the trails. And I'm really intentional about setting them up for success. We try to eat well. We eat food that is healthy for our brain. We're not militant on this topic, right? I mean, they've had a Coke in their life and there's a bag of Cheetos in here, but generally we're eating fruits and vegetables and lean proteins and a balanced diet. We have a snack and, M&Ms occasionally, but the chapter is episodic. It's like all of a sudden I go to brain health because I think it's so important. And Daniel has kind of been, as you quote, the Dr. Oz of the brain, helping to really evangelize the need for us to become much more aware of how everything in our life and our body is driven not only by our heart, but by our brain. And we need to become much more careful with it.
Well, and I think that listeners should know as well, if they haven't listened to a recent podcast of mine with Dr. Wes Ely from Vanderbilt, Every Deep Drawn Breath, that, when COVID came, we stepped back 20 years in the ICU. And the reality is there is a protocol that should be being followed. And one of those protocols, as you were talking about, is our brain is connected by our spine. When our spine doesn't move, our brain atrophies, and then there's delirium. And all these post-COVID symptoms are a result of how they're actually being treated in the ICU today, because we went and said, okay, let's incubate them. Let's basically put them on benzo drugs, which really are the worst thing in the world they could do for the brain. The best thing that could happen, I'm saying to my listeners that this is based on Vanderbilt, 21,000 people studied. If COVID came to your family, number one, you got to keep the family connection. That's the first thing they took away, was that community. Second thing, and I think this is important to actually mention, is that you need to keep those people awake, not asleep, not in a coma. Okay. And you need to, when you can, keep them moving. Okay. And this new protocol is now in 60% of the hospitals. So, when you talk about post-COVID symptoms, delirium, people are acting like they have Alzheimer's disease. It's a result of how they were treated, the drugs they were treated with, and the lack of movement when they were there. Sorry for getting off on that tangent, but I thought it was really important.
I learned from you.
In chapter about Bob Whitman, you cited 2 stories about servant leadership. And I was just talking with the future leader guy, Jacob Miller, and I brought up the Greenleaf School of Philosophy and Leadership, which is, who are you serving? Are your people serving you, or are you serving them? Can you read a little of his stories and what our listeners can take away from those stories?
We hear this term servant leadership a lot, and I don't know what the definition of it definitively is. We've all got a version of it. We have a version in our mind.
Yeah.
But what I chose to do for the book was to talk about it literally. Bob Whitman is the 22-year CEO and chairman of our company. He has, by most estimates, significant personal wealth. He has, graduated from Harvard. He's climbed the Matterhorn. He's done the Ironman in Kona 20 plus times. He's invited back every year. He's a typical high-performing athlete, CEO, a man of impeccable character and integrity. We fight like father and son, right? But I love him and he loves me. I chose to share a story in the book about literally him serving, because Bob has a chef. Bob has a grounds crew caretaker for his homes. He has a caretaker for his family. He's earned it. He's earned a lot of wealth in his life because he's worked very hard, and he has a team around him personally. But what I share in the book, as you referenced, is 2 stories where Bob literally served his team. One of them was an event we had in Chicago where it was a team meeting, several hundred people. The hotel fire alarm went off right before lunch. We moved 150 people out to the parking lot, took a couple of hours for it to be resolved. And we were, money was clicking, right? The clock was ticking on a 2-day conference with 150 people who'd flown in. And so across the street, I spied a pizza restaurant. And I said, Bob, what do you think? And he said, let's go do it. We went and we put 150 people in a pizza restaurant. And what was interesting is while everyone sat down with like their forks and their knives ready to go, including all of the presidents and the vice presidents in the company, it was Bob Whitman, the chairman, the biggest shareholder in the company, who was at the counter with me, ordering pizzas, ordering appetizers, delivering mozzarella sticks, pouring root beer, running Parmesan and red pepper flakes out because that's who he is.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, he was pouring root beer in the mugs of presidents and vice presidents, while as the chairman and CEO, who could have bought and sold the restaurant 1,000 times over, not because he's falsely humble, not because it's just who he is. He's a servant leader. And so in the chapter, I take it a little far accurately by saying, you know what? Sometimes servant leadership is literally serving.
I think, people like that, no matter who it is, they see what needs to be done and they take action.
That's
and
right.
they
Which
do
is
it.
Why they're successful.
And it's a man of action, right? And it's important what you just said, because none of that is beneath him. If you look at everybody, we all started from humble beginnings in most cases, unless we were brought up in a family where, there was, we were multimillionaires or something. So, I wanted to touch on this one because in the chapter about Stephen Covey, you mentioned that no matter the circumstances, pulling the plug requires integrity. What advice can you give to our listeners in deciding whether to move forward with full conviction, pause, stop, or pull the plug, whether it's an initiative or whether it's on something even more important like that, like, hey, I made a wrong move.
Yeah. I can't prescribe the criteria you should go through on pulling the plug. But as you mentioned, what I can describe is recognizing that it's okay to pull the plug. The master mentor is Stephen M.R. Covey, the oldest son of our co-founder, Stephen R. Covey. He wrote the book, The Speed of Trust. You ought to have him on sometime if you haven't. It's the most seminal book.
I had Greg Link on.
Oh, you did? Yeah. So he's a co-operating partner. Yeah. Small world, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, it's very small.
Yeah. I think most people thought that the insight I would share from Stephen M.R. Covey was around trust, right? The 13 behaviors of high trust leaders. His book has sold 2.5 million copies now. Not too shabby. But I don't. I rewind 20 years when he was the president of our firm prior to Bob Whitman. And he pulled the plug on a very important, vital product launch. We were getting ready to launch a new leadership initiative. 12+ salespeople have sold hundreds of engagements to clients, and it wasn't ready. The product wasn't at the quality that the Franklin Covey company was known for. And Stephen M.R. Covey made a very bold, unpopular decision, cost people all kinds of money, but he had his eye set on the long term. He was thinking about our reputation, our brand, our client success, the referrals, the satisfaction. He was bold enough to be extraordinarily unpopular in the moment. I mean, people lost a lot of money. Consultants lost billable days. Salespeople lost commissions. Clients lost faith and commitment in the short term. But in the long term, he built the respect of me and countless hundreds of others for having the courage to say, is this the right thing for the long term? Mm-hmm. Is this right for our reputation, for our brand? Yeah, we could go get the $3 or $4 million of business that's already been booked, but at the expense of 30 or 40 million? No way.
Right.
Very unpopular. The chapter, I hope, resonates with everyone who's facing a decision of your own, whether to double down, whether to quadruple down, whether to pause and say, what should we do? Whether to take perhaps the unprecedentedly unpopular position to pull the plug, not let the chips fall where they will, but just help pick up the pieces to say, I see something that others don't see, and this is my job as a leader, is to look around corners, is to be a little bit of a clairvoyant, so to speak, and understand the short-term gain isn't worth the long-term risk.
Rita McGrath, Seeing Around Corners.
Rita McGrath.
So what I would say is that in adding to what you just said, look, after you take all the analytics and the data on making a decision like that, you've listened to all the managers, you've listened to all the other executives, and you have to pull the plug or whatever it is decision you're going to make. Deep down inside, if you look at some of our greatest leaders, the biggest guide they ever had is their intuition. And you really need to listen to the intuition. I wrote a book on it, Hacking the Gap, a journey from intuition to innovation and beyond. And it really does take you tapping into whatever you want to say, a higher power, to hear what that is, that voice. Be discerning, make sure it's not your ego that's speaking, but make sure it's this higher voice that's speaking to you that you hear, whether you're auditory, kinesthetic, however it might be. Some people feel it and they get a gut feeling and they go, nope, I'm not going to do that. It's the wrong thing to do. And I would just encourage my listeners, your listeners, whoever's listening to this, try and learn how to cultivate the ability to tap into that intuition. It isn't all about the numbers that come off of an Excel spreadsheet. It isn't all about what all the other managers say frequently. Sometimes you have to tap into a higher source. So if you were to leave our listeners with one or two single points that you'd like to have them take away from this new book, what would it be, and how can they integrate this advice into their daily work life? Because look, at the end, you've done hundreds of these interviews. I'm on almost 900.
Yes.
And the way I look at it is everybody wants to know, okay, guys, you've talked to me for 35 minutes so far. Tell me now what I can do today, now, tomorrow, right? So I'm asking you that. What kind of advice would you give in that direction?
You know, I may have mentioned this in our previous conversations, but of all of the wisdom I've gleaned from these 200 interviews, from working with Dr. Stephen R. Covey for 15 years and all the greats in my career that I've been blessed to be listening to, it's this idea from Dr. Covey around understanding the difference between being efficient and being effective. It is by far the most profound insight that I've learned, because I think there's a lot of leaders like me, more like me than not. And that is what has made them so successful is their own productivity, their own efficiency. They just get stuff done. They're productive. They wake up early, they work hard, they check things off, they do the right things, but they get stuff done. And that it's that efficiency mindset that when people like me that are naturally efficient and productive, when they try to move that into our relationships, it creates havoc. You cannot be efficient with people. You can only be effective. This is a cliche, but it is true. Every company is now a technology company, and every company is now in the same business. They're in the relationship business, period. And so if you recognize that your ultimate competitive advantage in your business are the relationships amongst your employees and your colleagues and your funders and your advisors and your lenders and your clients and your suppliers, everything is about your relationships. So make sure that you're not moving what might be your strength, which is your efficiency, into your relationships. Dr. Covey said, with people, fast is slow and slow is fast. And it's a huge transformation for me because I'm a naturally efficient person. I like to check things off, get things done, move it along. I'm uncomfortable with silence. I like to always be in motion. And that's not how you build high trust, mutually beneficial relationships. Slow down with people.
Well, I appreciate you slowing down to take this call for this podcast. And I think that the wisdom that you've imparted on my listeners is great. I'm going to direct all of my listeners to go to scottjeffreymiller.com. That's one place where you can learn about all of his books. You also can go to onleadership.com, and that's where you see his show. All right. And it's more than just a podcast show because he's literally taping it and putting it out there. I am too, but not in the same way. He's in a studio. It's pretty well
You're in a
put
studio. I
together.
love your background.
Oh yeah, but it's nothing like what he's doing. And what I would say is, seriously, Scott, you've been on 3 or 4 times now, and every time you bring such enthusiasm to the show. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all you're doing. And you've got more books coming out, so make sure that we get back in touch. And when these new books get out, we'll have you back on again,
Thank you.
and we'll keep getting them to our leaders who are out there listening. Appreciate you. Appreciate your time. Namaste to you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Greg, thank you. Thanks for your abundance mentality. You are the model of what Dr. Covey called an abundant leader. Thank you again.
Thank you.